The carriage wheels crunched through fresh snow as I pressed my face against the frosted window, watching the familiar landmarks of our estate disappear behind us. My stepmother Catherine sat across from me, her lips curved in what anyone else might mistake for a motherly smile. My stepsister Celestine practically bounced in her seat, golden curls catching the weak winter light as she chattered about the upcoming season in the capital. "Oh, Serafina," she said, not bothering to look at me. "I do hope you'll remember your place once we reach the city. It would be terribly embarrassing if you tried to put yourself forward at any of the gatherings." "Of course," I murmured, my voice barely audible over the wind howling outside. The poison tea they'd given me that morning was making my limbs feel heavy, my thoughts sluggish. They'd been so careful about it, adding just a touch to my morning cup. Enough to make me compliant, but not enough to kill me. Yet. That pleasure, I was beginning to realize, they'd reserved for this journey. "Such a good girl," Catherine cooed, reaching over to pat my hand with fingers that felt like ice, so understanding about family obligations. Father cleared his throat from his corner of the carriage, not meeting my eyes. He'd barely spoken to me in months, ever since Catherine had convinced him that I was stealing from the household accounts. The bruises from his last correction had only just faded from my ribs. "The weather's getting worse," he observed, peering out at the swirling snow. "Perhaps we should stop at the next inn." "Nonsense," Catherine said firmly. "We're making excellent time. And besides, we have that important matter to discuss with Serafina." My blood turned to ice water in my veins. Through my drug-hazed thoughts, I saw Celestine's smile sharpen, saw the way Father's jaw tightened. This was it. Whatever they'd been planning, whatever reason they'd had for insisting I accompany them on this journey, we'd reached the moment of truth. "What matter?" I asked, though part of me already knew. Catherine's mask finally slipped, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "The matter of your future, dear, or rather, your lack of one." The carriage began to slow, and I realized with growing horror that we were nowhere near an inn. We were in the middle of the forest, miles from the nearest village, with night falling and the snow growing thicker by the minute. "You see," Catherine continued conversationally, "your father and I have been doing some calculations about inheritance laws, family obligations, that sort of thing. It seems there's been a terrible oversight in our planning." "What she means," Celestine said, her voice bright with malicious joy, "is that you're in the way. You always have been, but now it's becoming a real problem." Father finally looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes made my heart stop. Not love, not even recognition. Just cold, practical assessment. "You're legitimate," he said quietly. "Born to my first wife, before I knew Catherine. Under imperial law, that means you inherit before Celestine." "But I don't want," I started to protest. "What you want is irrelevant," Catherine snapped. "What matters is what the law says. And the law says that as long as you live, Celestine's marriage prospects are complicated." The carriage had stopped completely now. Through the window, I could see nothing but darkness and swirling snow. The driver was climbing down from his perch, his boots crunching in the snow as he moved to open our door. "The Duke of Ravencrest's son has finally agreed to consider Celestine," Father said, his voice carefully neutral. "It's the match we've been hoping for, the one that will save our family from bankruptcy. But he won't sign any contracts while there's a question about inheritance." "So you see our problem," Catherine said sweetly. "We need you to step aside." "Step aside how?" I whispered, though I already knew. Celestine laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, Serafina, you always were slow. We're going to leave you here, of course, in the snow, in the middle of nowhere, with that lovely poison tea keeping you nice and weak." The carriage door opened, letting in a blast of frigid air. The driver stood waiting, his face carefully blank. He'd been paid well for his silence, I realized. Paid to forget that he'd ever seen me on this journey. "Out!" Catherine ordered. I tried to resist, but the poison had done its work too well. My limbs wouldn't obey me, my vision was starting to blur. Father had to half carry me from the carriage, his touch impersonal and cold. "Please," I managed to whisper as he set me down in the snow. "I'm your daughter." For just a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Regret, perhaps. or simply irritation at the inconvenience. "You were Elena's daughter," he said finally. "Elena's dead, and after tonight, so are you." They climbed back into the carriage without another word. Celestine waved at me through the window, her smile radiant with triumph. "Give my regards to Mother," she called out as the driver urged the horses forward. "Oh, wait, you'll be seeing her soon enough." And then they were gone, leaving me alone in the dark with nothing but the sound of wind through the trees and the growing numbness in my limbs. I tried to stand, to follow the carriage tracks, but the poison and the cold were too much. My legs gave out, sending me sprawling face first into the snow. This was how I was going to die. Alone, forgotten, betrayed by the only family I'd ever known. The irony wasn't lost on me. After years of being treated like I was already dead, they were finally making it official. I don't know how long I lay there. Long enough for the snow to begin covering me. Long enough for the cold to seep so deep into my bones that I stopped shivering. My thoughts were fragmenting, memories and hallucinations blending together in a haze of approaching death. I saw my mother's face, kind and loving in a way I barely remembered. I saw myself as a child, before Catherine came, when father still called me his little star. I saw the gradual erosion of that love, piece by piece, until nothing remained but cold practicality. The sound of hoofbeats through the storm seemed like another hallucination at first, but then they grew louder, closer, accompanied by the jingle of harness and the snorting of horses. Through the swirling snow, I caught a glimpse of torchlight. "There!" a deep voice called out. "Something in the snow!" Heavy boots crunched toward me, and then strong hands were lifting me from my frozen grave. I caught a glimpse of silver hair and eyes like winter storms, before consciousness slipped away completely. "Still breathing," the voice observed, neither kind nor cruel, simply stating fact. "Barely." I awoke 3 days later in a room that belonged in a palace. The bed I lay in was larger than the servants' quarters I'd called home for the past 5 years, draped in furs that probably cost more than my father's annual income. A fire crackled in an enormous marble fireplace, casting warm light over tapestries that depicted scenes of conquest and glory. But it was the man sitting beside my bed who commanded all my attention. He was perhaps 40 years old, with the kind of devastating masculine beauty that made women write terrible poetry and challenge each other to duels. Silver white hair fell to his shoulders, framing a face that could have been carved from marble by a master sculptor. But it was his eyes that truly captured me, pale gray like storm clouds and absolutely merciless. "You're awake," he said without looking up from the document he was reading. His voice was cultured, aristocratic, with just a hint of the northern accent that marked the old noble families. "Good." I was beginning to think I'd wasted my time. "Who are you?" I managed to croak. My throat felt like I'd swallowed broken glass. He finally looked at me, and I understood immediately why even grown men crossed themselves when they spoke his name. This was a predator wearing human form, beautiful and terrible, and absolutely without mercy. "Grand Duke Lysander Voss," he said calmly, "and you, according to the servants who recognized your clothing, are Lady Seraphina Ashford, the bastard daughter." The title was technically mine, though my family had spent years convincing everyone, including themselves, that I was nothing more than an inconvenient reminder of father's first marriage. "They left you to die," he continued conversationally, as if we were discussing the weather. "Your own family. Quite efficiently done, actually. Poison to weaken you, then abandonment in a blizzard. No evidence, no witnesses. Clean?" I tried to sit up, and he made no move to help me. "Why did you save me?" His smile was like a blade being drawn from its sheath. "I didn't save you, Lady Seraphina. I simply delayed your death long enough to determine whether you might be useful." That should have terrified me. Any sane person would have been terrified. Instead, lying there in his fortress, surrounded by luxury I'd never known, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: hope. Because Grand Duke Lysander Voss wasn't known for his mercy or his kindness. He was known for his absolute ruthlessness in destroying anyone who crossed him. And if there was one thing I'd learned in my 20 years of life, it was how to recognize an opportunity when the gods placed it directly in my path. The abuse had started small, the way it always does with families who pride themselves on their respectability. When mother died in childbirth when I was 5, trying to give father the son he desperately wanted, he remarried within 6 months. Lady Catherine Blackwood was everything a grieving widower could want: beautiful, accomplished, wealthy enough to solve his immediate financial problems, and blessed with a daughter who could serve as a companion for his own child. "You'll love having a sister," father had told me as we waited for them to arrive. "Celestine is just 2 years younger than you, and Lady Catherine says she's very sweet." Sweet, that was one word for her. The changes came gradually. At first, it was just small things that I was too young to recognize as deliberate. My portion at dinner grew smaller while Celestine's grew larger. "Growing girls need proper nutrition," Catherine would say, stroking Celestine's golden curls. My governess was dismissed for unnecessary expenses, while Celestine's tutors multiplied. My mother's jewelry began disappearing piece by piece, sold to pay for household expenses, that somehow only seemed to benefit my new family members. "You must understand, Serafina," father would say whenever I dared to question these changes. "Celestine is the future of this family. She needs every advantage if she's to make a good marriage and bring honor to our name." "But what about me?" I'd asked once when I was perhaps 7. "You." Father had looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "You're a girl, dear. Your job is to support your sister and help her succeed. That's what good daughters do." By the time I was 10, I'd moved from the nursery to a smaller room down the hall. By 12, I was sleeping in what had once been a guest room. By 15, I was in the servants' quarters, my allowance docked for every small infraction Catherine could invent. "Serafina spilled wine on the tablecloth," she'd tell father over dinner, her voice heavy with disappointment. And she was impertinent when I corrected her. "I'm afraid we'll have to take the cost of cleaning from her allowance." The wine had been deliberately knocked over by Celestine, who'd thought it was hilarious to watch me scramble to clean up the mess. But Catherine had seen an opportunity to punish me for existing, and she'd never been one to waste such chances. "She's so clumsy," Celestine would add, blue eyes wide with false sympathy, "and so ungrateful for everything we do for her. Really, Papa, I don't know why we bother." Father, who had once read me bedtime stories and called me his little star, began to look at me with increasing irritation. The warmth in his eyes when he looked at me was gradually replaced by the cool assessment he might give a disappointing horse or a servant who'd broken something valuable. "Elena spoiled her," I heard him tell Catherine one night when they thought I was asleep. "Made her think she was special somehow. It's taking time to correct the damage." "Don't worry, darling," Catherine had replied, her voice warm with affection for him and cold satisfaction about me. "Children can be trained, given proper guidance. She'll learn her place eventually." The beating started when I was 16. Not the kind that left obvious marks. Catherine was far too clever for that. Instead, it was quick slaps when no one was looking, pinches that left bruises hidden under my clothes, hair pulled hard enough to bring tears to my eyes, but not hard enough to leave lasting damage. "Serafina is going through a difficult phase," Catherine would explain to anyone who asked about my frequent jumpiness or the way I flinched when anyone moved too quickly near me. "Some children rebel against authority. We're doing our best to guide her through it." The servants, most of whom had known me since birth, began to look at me with a mixture of pity and fear. They could see what was happening, but they also knew that speaking out would cost them their positions. And who would believe them anyway? Catherine was charming, beloved by the local society. I was just the awkward stepdaughter who never seemed to fit in anywhere. "She's always been difficult," Catherine would tell visitors, shaking her head with theatrical sadness. "Nothing like dear Celestine. I do my best with her, but some children are simply born wrong." The final transformation in father's attitude came when I was 18, after Catherine made her masterstroke. I'd been secretly saving money for months, selling off small pieces of my mother's jewelry that I'd managed to hide before Catherine inventoried her belongings. Not valuable pieces. I wasn't stupid enough to think I could hide the absence of emeralds or diamonds. But small things. A silver locket, a pair of pearl earrings, a cameo brooch that had belonged to my grandmother. My plan was simple. Save enough money to buy passage to the capital, where I could find work as a governess or companion. I had enough education, thanks to the books I'd stolen from father's library, and read by candlelight in my tiny room. I could make my own way in the world, far from Catherine's cruelty and father's indifference. I should have known she was watching me. Edmund! She'd shrieked that morning, her voice carrying through the entire house. Edmund, come quickly. I've discovered something terrible. I'd been in the stables, helping with the morning feeding, when I heard the commotion. By the time I reached the house, she'd already assembled her evidence. The small pouch of coins I'd hidden under my mattress, the receipts from the jewelry sales, even a letter I'd been writing to a potential employer in the capital. Stealing from the family, she declared, holding up the evidence for Father and Celestine to see. After everything we've done for her, everything we've sacrificed to give her a home, she's been robbing us blind. But those were my mother's things, I protested. They belong to me. Your mother's things belong to this family, Father said coldly. You have no right to sell them without permission. And this, he held up the letter. This proves you've been planning to abandon your duties to your sister. I wasn't abandoning anything. I was trying to make my own way. The slap came so fast I didn't see it coming. Not from Catherine this time, but from Father himself. A hard, ringing blow that sent me stumbling backward and left my ear ringing. You're no daughter of mine, he said, and I could see nothing but disgust in his eyes. Elena's death was a mercy if it meant she didn't have to see what her child became. That was the moment I truly understood that I was alone in the world. Catherine's smile was radiant with triumph as she watched me touch my burning cheek. Celestine actually clapped her hands with delight, as if she'd just witnessed a particularly entertaining performance. From now on, Father continued, his voice deadly quiet, you'll earn your keep like any other servant in this household. No allowance, no privileges, no expectations of special treatment. And if I catch you stealing again, from anyone, for any reason, I'll have you arrested and transported. But where will I sleep? I asked, knowing the answer but needing to hear it said aloud. In the servants' hall with the other help, Catherine said sweetly, where you belong. And that was how I spent the last 2 years of my life in my father's house, as an unpaid servant, scrubbing floors that Celestine would deliberately dirty, washing clothes that Catherine would inspect with a magnifying glass for any excuse to punish me, cooking meals that I was only allowed to eat after everyone else had finished. The poisoning started 6 months ago, though I didn't realize it at the time. Serafina looks pale, Celestine had observed one morning, studying me with the same clinical interest she might show a bug she was planning to pull the wings off. Don't you think she looks sickly, Mama? Now that you mention it, yes, Catherine had replied thoughtfully. Perhaps we should make sure she's getting proper nutrition. The poor dear works so hard. Suddenly, my meals came with special additions. Herbal tonics that Catherine insisted would improve my health. Extra portions of certain dishes that made me feel nauseated afterward. Tea that tasted slightly bitter but which I was told contained medicinal herbs that would strengthen my constitution. You're so good to her, Mama, Celestine would say, watching me force down another cup of the bitter tea. Even though she's so ungrateful for everything you do. I grew thinner, weaker, more prone to dizzy spells and confusion. The servants whispered that I was working myself to death, but I knew better. I'd read enough books on poisons to recognize arsenic when I tasted it. They were killing me slowly, carefully, making it look like the natural result of overwork and poor health. And they were enjoying every minute of it. Poor Serafina, Catherine would sigh whenever anyone asked about my condition. She's never been strong, not like Celestine. We do our best for her, but some people simply aren't built for this world. The final acceleration came 3 weeks ago, when the letter arrived from the Duke of Ravencrest. I wasn't supposed to see it, but I was cleaning the study when it was delivered, and I caught a glimpse of the ducal seal before Catherine snatched it away. That night, I heard them talking in urgent whispers behind closed doors. I finally agreed to meet with her. But the inheritance question, have to be resolved before, can't wait any longer. The next morning, my medicinal tea was stronger than usual. Strong enough to make me violently ill, strong enough that I couldn't keep solid food down for days. When I finally recovered enough to work, I overheard Celestine talking to her maid about wedding plans. That was when I knew I was out of time. The question now, Grand Duke Voss said, settling back in his chair with predatory grace, is what you intend to do about it. We were in his private study, a magnificent room lined with books and battle trophies. I'd been recovering in his castle for a week now, regaining my strength while he investigated the circumstances of my accident. The results of that investigation were laid out on the desk between us, a thick folder of documents, letters, and sworn statements. Do about what? I asked, though I suspected I knew. About the fact that your family tried to murder you for your inheritance. His pale eyes glittered with something that might have been amusement. Oh, yes, Lady Seraphina. I know exactly why they wanted you dead. He opened the folder and spread the contents across the polished wood. Financial records, correspondence, even receipts from apothecary shops showing Catherine's purchases of arsenic and other poisons. Your father owes significant debts to several noble houses, he explained, his tone conversational. His estate is mortgaged beyond its value. His investments have failed spectacularly, and his creditors are growing impatient. He needs Celestine to marry well, very well, to save the family from complete financial ruin. But what does that have to do with me? Everything. He pulled out a legal document yellowed with age. This is your parents' marriage contract, signed when your mother was 17. Very thorough document, actually. It specifies that any children of the marriage inherit before any children of subsequent marriages. I stared at the paper, trying to make sense of the legal language. You mean? I mean you're legitimate, born to his first wife, and under imperial law that makes you your father's primary heir. As long as you live, Celestine's claim to the estate is legally worthless. His smile was sharp as broken glass. No respectable family would accept her as a bride with such a massive legal complication hanging over any potential marriage contracts. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. They couldn't just disinherit me. Not legally. Your mother's family was well connected and the marriage contracts were ironclad. The Corvelli family didn't believe in leaving their daughters vulnerable to the whims of husbands. He leaned forward, his gaze intense. Your father's only options were to wait for you to die naturally, arrange a convenient accident, or marry you off to someone who would formally renounce your inheritance rights. And since no one would marry me without a dowry, death it was. He gestured to another set of documents. They'd been poisoning you slowly for months, building up to what would have looked like a natural death from illness and overwork. But something must have forced their hand. I remembered Celestine's excitement that morning, the way she'd practically glowed with anticipation as they prepared for their journey to the capital. The Duke of Ravencrest's son, I said quietly. He finally agreed to meet with her. Exactly. A marriage prospect so important and so time-sensitive that they couldn't afford to wait for the slow poison to do its work. The Duke's expression was coldly satisfied. So they decided on a more direct approach, and they very nearly succeeded. Indeed. If my men hadn't been patrolling that road, you'd be dead and buried under the snow by now. Celestine would be announcing her engagement within the month, and your father's debts would become someone else's problem. I stared down at the evidence of my family's betrayal, feeling something hot and terrible growing in my chest. For years, I'd told myself that they didn't mean to be cruel, that Catherine was just protecting her own daughter, that father was simply misguided in his favoritism. But this was cold-blooded murder, planned and executed with the same care most people put into organizing a dinner party. Why are you telling me this? I asked finally. Because you have a choice to make. The Duke leaned back in his chair, studying me with those merciless gray eyes. You can thank me for saving your life, accept a small pension, and disappear quietly to some remote corner of the Empire where you can live out your days in obscurity. Or you can learn the truth about your mother's real inheritance and help me destroy the people who tried to murder you. My heart stopped. What truth? His smile was magnificent and terrible. The truth that you're not just the legitimate heir to a bankrupt estate, Lady Seraphina. You're one of the wealthiest women in the Empire. Grand Duke Lysander Voss, it turned out, had not saved me out of kindness or even whim. He'd saved me because he was my mother's cousin, and he'd been watching my family's treatment of me for years with growing fury. Elena was my father's sister's daughter, he explained, pulling out a miniature portrait I recognized from my mother's jewelry box. The only family I had left after the plague took my parents when I was young. We were as close as siblings, despite the difference in our ages. She never mentioned you. Because I was away on campaign for most of your childhood, fighting the Emperor's wars on the northern borders. By the time I returned and learned of Elena's death, you'd already disappeared so thoroughly into that household that I couldn't be certain you were even still alive. But you kept watching. I kept waiting for you to run away, to write to me, to give me any excuse to intervene. When you didn't, I assumed you were either dead or somehow content with your circumstances. His expression grew deadly. I was wrong on both counts. Why didn't you help me before? Because accusations against a peer require evidence, and your family was very careful never to abuse you in public. He gestured to the documents spread across his desk. But I have that evidence now. Every arsenic purchase Catherine made through intermediaries. Every meeting your father had with moneylenders. Every letter Celestine wrote to her friends mocking your circumstances. I stared at the papers, hardly daring to believe it. How did you get all this? Money, dear cousin. Money and the fact that servants gossip when they're properly motivated. His eyes glittered dangerously. Your family made one crucial error. They assumed that because they'd isolated you from society, no one important was paying attention to their treatment of you. They were catastrophically wrong. He stood and moved to a portrait hanging behind his desk. A young woman with dark hair and kind eyes that I recognized from my earliest memories. Elena was more than just my cousin, he said quietly. She was the closest thing to a sister I ever had. When she died, I swore on her grave that I would protect her daughter if she ever needed protection. But you said she had a real inheritance. What did you mean? He turned back to me, and for the first time since I'd met him, his expression held something other than cold calculation. Something that might have been grief. Your mother was a Corvelli before she married your father, one of the wealthiest trading families in the empire. He returned to his desk and pulled out another set of documents. When she married, she brought a modest dowry to satisfy propriety. But she also maintained significant assets separate from the marriage. But father always said she had no money of her own. Because she never told him about it. The Corvelli women learned centuries ago to keep their finances independent of their husbands. He handed me a letter in handwriting I dimly remembered. She left everything to you, held in trust until your 21st birthday or marriage, whichever came first. I've been the trustee all these years waiting for you to come of age. I opened the letter with trembling hands, recognizing my mother's elegant script. My dearest Serafina, if you are reading this, then I am gone and you have reached your majority. I pray that your father has been kind to you, but if not, know that you are not dependent on his kindness for your future. The enclosed documents detail your inheritance from the Corvelli family. You are wealthy in your own right, my darling, and no one, not your father, not any husband, not anyone, can take that away from you. Use this gift wisely, but do not let anyone convince you that you are less than you are. You are Elena Corvelli's daughter, and that means you bow to no one. All my love, mother. I looked up at the Duke through tears I hadn't realized I was shedding. How much? 6 million imperial crowns last valuation, plus properties in 4 provinces, shipping interests, mines, and a controlling stake in the Imperial Bank of Commerce. His smile was sharp as a blade. Your father's entire estate, even before his recent financial difficulties, was worth perhaps 50,000 crowns. The magnitude of it was staggering. All those years of being told I was worthless, a burden, an unwanted drain on the family resources, while I was actually worth more than everyone who'd tormented me combined. They have no idea, I whispered, none whatsoever, and that, my dear cousin, is how we destroy them. We? Oh yes. The Duke's smile turned predatory. You didn't think I'd let my beloved cousin's murderers escape justice, did you? Elena's daughter deserves her revenge, and I intend to see that she gets it. I stared at him, understanding finally dawning. You planned this, all of it. I planned to rescue you, yes. The rest, the timing, the circumstances, the perfect storm of their own greed and stupidity, that was simply fortune smiling on the righteous. He leaned forward, his gray eyes blazing. The question now, Lady Serafina Corvelli Ashford, is how thorough you want that revenge to be. I thought of Celestine's laughter as she'd waved goodbye from the carriage, of Catherine's satisfied smile as she'd served me poisoned tea, of Father's fist connecting with my face as he disowned me for the crime of existing. I want them destroyed, I said quietly. Completely. I want them to lose everything they value, everything they've built their lives around. I want them to understand exactly what they threw away when they decided I was worthless. The Duke's smile was magnificent and terrible. Then let me explain your true inheritance and how we're going to use it to give you everything you deserve. The plan was beautiful in its simplicity and devastating in its scope. Celestine's engagement to the Ravencrest heir will be announced at the midwinter ball in 3 weeks, the Duke explained, spreading out invitations and social calendars across his desk. It's to be the social event of the season. Everyone who matters in the Empire will be there. Your father has mortgaged everything he owns to pay for Celestine's trousseau and the engagement celebration. And if the engagement falls through, he loses everything: the estate, his title, his position in society. Catherine's family has already made it clear that they consider her marriage to your father a temporary alliance. They won't take her back if she's disgraced. And Celestine, he shrugged elegantly. Well, a woman who's been publicly jilted by such a prominent family finds her prospects severely limited. But how do we make the engagement fall through? By giving young Lord Ravencrest a better option. The Duke's smile was brilliant. Namely you. I stared at him. Me? But I'm supposed to be dead. Exactly. Your dramatic return from the dead, as the newly revealed heiress to one of the Empire's greatest fortunes, will be the scandal of the century. And when the story comes out about how your family tried to murder you for your inheritance. He gestured gracefully. Well, let's just say that the Ravencrest family will find aligning themselves with attempted murderers somewhat unpalatable. Will Lord Ravencrest actually want to marry me, though? He doesn't even know I exist. He will after the ball. You'll be the most eligible woman in the Empire. Beautiful, wealthy beyond imagination, and with a story tragic enough to capture every romantic's heart. The Duke's eyes glittered with anticipation. Besides, Marcus Ravencrest is a decent young man from everything I've heard. Certainly more honorable than your current family. And if he proves unsuitable, he shrugged. You'll have dozens of other options once your true status is known. And my family will be left with nothing. No money, no prospects, no allies, and the knowledge that they destroyed themselves through their own greed and cruelty. He stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the snow-covered grounds of his estate. They threw away the greatest prize in the Empire because they were too consumed with petty jealousy to recognize what they had. I felt something hot and fierce burning in my chest, not quite anger, not quite anticipation, but something that combined the best elements of both. When do we begin? We already have. The Duke turned back to me, his expression satisfied. The invitations to the midwinter ball were sent out yesterday morning, and I took the liberty of adding your name to the guest list. Lady Serafina Corvelli Ashford, ward of Grand Duke Voss, making her debut into Imperial society. They'll recognize me. Will they? He assessed me critically, taking in my improved appearance after days of proper food and medical attention. You've been living as a servant for years, malnourished and systematically abused. A few weeks of luxury, proper clothing, and the confidence that comes with knowing your true worth. He smiled. You'll be unrecognizable. And even if they do realize who you are, what can they say? That they tried to murder you? That they've been lying about your death for weeks? The plan was flawless, and we both knew it. There's one more thing, he added, almost casually. The revelation of your mother's inheritance will require a formal investigation into why it was concealed from you for so long. I've already notified the Imperial Court about potential irregularities in your father's guardianship. What kind of irregularities? The kind that carry criminal penalties. Theft, fraud, attempted murder. The usual charges when someone tries to steal an heiress's inheritance by killing her. His smile was absolutely vicious. Your father will be fortunate if he only loses his title. Catherine and Celestine will be fortunate if they avoid the executioner's block. I stared at him, finally understanding the full scope of what we were planning. This wasn't just revenge. This was total annihilation. "Are you having second thoughts?" he asked quietly. I thought of my mother's jewelry being sold to buy Celestine's gowns, of the years of abuse disguised as family discipline, of the poison burning through my veins as I lay dying in the snow, abandoned by the people who should have protected me. "No," I said firmly. "I want them to understand what it feels like to lose everything. I want them to know that their own choices destroyed them." "Good." The Duke moved to his desk and pulled out a small velvet box. "Then it's time for you to reclaim what was always yours." Inside the box was my mother's signet ring, the one Catherine had claimed was lost years ago. The Corvelli family crest glittered on the band, a raven in flight surrounded by stars. "She left specific instructions that you should wear this when you finally take your rightful place in the world," he said softly. I slipped the ring onto my finger, and for the first time in 15 years, I felt truly like my mother's daughter, like someone who belonged somewhere, who had value beyond what others chose to give me. "Perfect," the Duke murmured, studying me with satisfaction. "Now let's discuss exactly how we're going to destroy your family." The transformation began immediately. Over the next 3 weeks, Grand Duke Voss spared no expense in preparing me for my debut. The best seamstresses in the empire worked around the clock to create a wardrobe worthy of my newfound status. Master jewelers crafted accessories that complemented my mother's heirloom pieces. Dancing masters, etiquette instructors, and language tutors polished away any remaining traces of the servant I'd been forced to become. But the most important change was internal. "You are not Seraphina Ashford, the unwanted bastard daughter," the Duke reminded me daily. "You are Lady Seraphina Corvelli Ashford, heiress to one of the Empire's greatest fortunes. You bow to no one, you apologize to no one, and you certainly don't allow anyone to make you feel small." It was harder than it sounds, unlearning years of conditioning that had taught me to make myself invisible, to apologize for existing, to accept whatever scraps of affection or attention others chose to throw my way. But with each passing day, I felt more of my mother's steel flowing through my veins. "Tell me about your family," he said one evening as we dined together in his private chambers. "What about them? What they value most? What they're most afraid of losing? What would hurt them more than death itself?" I considered the question carefully. Father values his reputation above everything else, being seen as honorable, respectable, worthy of his peers' respect. Catherine values her position in society, being the lady of the manor, having people defer to her, being envied by other women. And Celestine. Yes, Celestine values being the center of attention, being beautiful, desired, the object of every man's desire and every woman's envy. She'd rather die than be ignored or outshone. The Duke's smile was satisfied. "Perfect. Then we know exactly how to hurt them." On the morning of the ball, he presented me with the final element of my transformation, a gown that was nothing short of magnificent. "Midnight blue silk shot through with silver threads," he explained as his seamstresses helped me into it. "The colors of the Corvelli family and the exact shade your mother wore to her own debut. The diamonds are from the family vault. They've been waiting 20 years for someone worthy to wear them." I barely recognized the woman looking back at me from the mirror. Gone was the pale, frightened servant who'd scrubbed floors and accepted abuse as the natural order of things. In her place stood someone who looked every inch the powerful heiress I actually was. Confident, beautiful, radiating the kind of presence that commanded attention and respect. "Ready?" the Duke asked, offering me his arm. I looked once more at my reflection, at the ring gleaming on my finger and the steel glinting in my eyes. "I'm ready." The Ravencrest mansion blazed with light as our carriage approached, every window glowing like a star against the winter darkness. Carriages lined the circular drive, disgorging the cream of imperial society in their finest evening wear. Through the enormous windows, I could see the ballroom packed with guests, the elite of the empire gathered to witness what they believed would be the Celestine's triumph. "Remember," the Duke murmured as we waited for our turn to disembark, "you are the most important person at this gathering. Act like it." The herald's voice rang out clear and strong as we entered the ballroom. Lady Seraphina Corvelli Ashford, ward of His Grace, the Grand Duke Lysander Voss. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. Wine glasses paused halfway to lips as everyone tried to process what they'd just heard. Corvelli? I heard someone whisper. But I thought that bloodline was extinct, yes. At least that's what we all believed. Look at her, she's magnificent. Those diamonds, good God, they must be worth a fortune. I felt every eye in the room on me as the Duke escorted me down the grand staircase. But I was looking for only 3 pairs of eyes in that sea of faces. I found them near the orchestra, clustered around a figure in golden silk who could only be Celestine. Father went white as a sheet when he saw me, his face draining of color so completely that I thought he might faint. Catherine's wineglass slipped from nerveless fingers to shatter on the marble floor, the crash audible even over the music. And Celestine, beautiful, cruel Celestine, stared at me with the exact expression I'd worn when I realized they meant to leave me for dead. Pure, absolute terror. Impossible, I heard Catherine whisper as we drew closer, her voice carrying just far enough for the surrounding guests to overhear. She's dead. We saw her. You saw nothing, the Duke interrupted pleasantly, his voice pitched to carry to the fascinated crowd gathering around us. Lady Seraphina has been recovering from her ordeal under my protection. Such a terrible thing. Being attacked by bandits and left for dead on the road. Fortunately, my men were able to rescue her before it was too late. The lie was perfect. It explained my absence, my condition when he found me, and most importantly, it established that my family had done nothing to help me when I needed them most. Seraphina? Father's voice cracked like an adolescent boy's. But we were told, that I was dead. I smiled at him, the same cold smile I'd learned from watching the Duke. No, Father dear, I'm very much alive, and I have such interesting stories to tell about my recovery. Young Lord Ravencrest was staring at me with unconcealed fascination, his previous dance partner, my stepsister, apparently forgotten. He was handsome enough, I supposed, with the kind of clean-cut aristocratic features that mothers found reassuring in their daughters' suitors. Lady Seraphina, he said, clearly struggling to reconcile my presence with whatever story he'd been told about my family, but I was given to understand that I didn't exist. I turned that cold smile on him, and he actually took a step back. Oh, I exist, my lord. In fact, I believe you'll find that I exist quite substantially. The Duke moved smoothly to make proper introductions, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly hushed ballroom. Lord Ravencrest, may I present my ward, Lady Seraphina Corvelli Ashford, the sole heir to the Corvelli fortune and holdings. I watched understanding dawn in the young lord's eyes as the implications hit him. Behind him, I saw Celestine's face cycle through a rainbow of emotions. Confusion, recognition, fear, and finally a kind of desperate fury. The Corvelli fortune? Lord Ravencrest repeated, his voice carefully neutral. I was under the impression that the family was very much alive and prospering, I assured him smoothly. Though I understand there's been some confusion about that recently. Perhaps we could dance, and I could clarify any misconceptions. He offered his arm without hesitation, leaving Celestine standing alone in her golden gown like a discarded doll. As we moved onto the dance floor, I heard the Duke's voice behind us, pitched perfectly for the crowd of fascinated nobles hanging on every word. Such a tragic story, really. Poor Seraphina was nearly murdered for her inheritance. By her own family, if you can believe such a thing. Poison, attempted to make it look like a natural death. If my men hadn't found her when they did. The gasps and scandalized whispers spread through the ballroom like wildfire. By the time our dance ended, half the party knew some version of the story, and the other half was desperately trying to find out what they'd missed. Is it true? Lord Ravencrest asked quietly as he led me from the dance floor. What the Duke is saying about your family? Every word, I said simply, though I'm sure they'll deny it. Murderers usually do. He glanced over at where my former family stood in a tight, panicked huddle, then back at me with something approaching awe. And the Corvelli inheritance? The rumors about your wealth? 6 million crowns at last accounting, plus extensive holdings throughout the empire. I met his eyes steadily. I'll be formally invested on my 21st birthday next month. After that, I'll be one of the wealthiest women in the empire. Good God. He stared at me with the same expression I'd seen on men's faces when they looked at priceless artwork or magnificent horses. And you're not promised to anyone? Entirely uncommitted, I confirmed, though I suspect that situation won't last long, once word spreads about my circumstances. It was a calculated risk, but it paid off beautifully. Within moments, Lord Ravencrest was asking permission to call on me, his previous engagement apparently forgotten. Within an hour, 3 other eligible bachelors had approached with similar requests, and I could see several more working up the courage to do the same. And across the ballroom, I watched my former family's world crumble in real time. Father was desperately trying to approach various creditors and business associates, his face growing more ashen with each conversation as they turned away from him with obvious distaste. Catherine sat alone at a small table, tears streaming down her face as former friends pointedly ignored her attempts to catch their attention. And Celestine stood in the center of the dance floor where Lord Ravencrest had abandoned her, still wearing her golden gown, as couple after couple danced around her like she was a piece of furniture. No one asked her to dance. No one approached her to chat. The girl who'd been the belle of the ball an hour ago had become completely invisible. "Enjoying yourself?" the Duke murmured as he appeared at my elbow with a glass of champagne. "Immensely," I replied, watching Father's increasingly frantic attempts to salvage something from the social disaster unfolding around him. "How long do you think it will take for complete destruction? Socially, they're already finished. No one wants to be associated with attempted murderers, especially ones stupid enough to try to kill the Empire's newest heiress." His smile was sharp as winter wind. "Legally, the Imperial investigators should be arriving any moment now." Investigators? Oh, yes. Attempted murder of an heiress, theft of Imperial funds, fraud. The charges are quite extensive. He handed me the champagne flute. "Your father will lose his title, of course. Catherine will likely face exile or execution, depending on how merciful the Emperor feels. And Celestine. What about Celestine? We'll discover that being the daughter of convicted criminals makes one somewhat less appealing as a marriage prospect. I imagine she'll end up working for her living, if she's very fortunate." I sipped my champagne and watched Celestine finally realize that no one was coming to rescue her from her humiliation. The look on her face was exactly the same one I'd worn so many times when I'd begged her to stop tormenting me, to show mercy, to remember that we were supposed to be family. "Perfect," I said softly. The arrest happened at the stroke of midnight, just as Celestine was making one last, desperate attempt to reclaim Lord Ravencrest's attention. The Imperial Guards entered the ballroom in full ceremonial regalia, and the entire gathering fell silent as they marched directly toward where my former family huddled together. "Lord Edmund Ashford," the captain announced, his voice carrying clearly through the enormous room. "Lady Catherine Ashford, Lady Celestine Ashford, you are under arrest by order of His Imperial Majesty for crimes against the person and property of Lady Seraphina Corvelli Ashford." The formal charges were read aloud for everyone to hear: attempted murder, theft, fraud, conspiracy, embezzlement, and half a dozen other crimes that would see them stripped of everything they owned and thrown into the deepest dungeons of the Imperial prison system. Father actually fell to his knees when he heard the extent of the evidence against them. Sworn statements from servants, financial records proving the systematic theft of my inheritance, even samples of the poison they'd been feeding me. Catherine screamed that it was all lies, that I was an ungrateful bastard who'd seduced the Duke into helping me take revenge on my loving family. And Celestine looked directly at me with pure hatred burning in her blue eyes. "You were nothing," she hissed as the guards placed her in shackles, her voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom. "You were supposed to be nothing forever." "I was never nothing," I replied calmly, my voice equally clear. "You just refused to see what I actually was." "You're a servant, a bastard, a worthless—" "I'm Lady Seraphina Corvelli Ashford," I interrupted, letting steel ring in my voice. heiress to 6 million crowns and one of the most powerful women in the empire. You're the daughter of attempted murderers who will be lucky to avoid the executioner's block." As they were led away through a crowd of horrified and fascinated nobles, Lord Ravencrest appeared at my side. "I have to ask," he said quietly, his voice pitched for my ears alone. "Was any of this planned? Did you orchestrate what happened tonight?" I considered lying, then decided he deserved honesty if we were going to have any kind of relationship. I knew they'd be here. I knew that seeing me alive and wealthy would destroy them. And I knew that justice needed to be served for what they tried to do to me. I met his eyes steadily. "But our conversation? This attraction between us? That's entirely genuine." He laughed, actually laughed, and offered me his arm again. "Lady Seraphina, I believe I'm falling in love with your sense of justice." "Good," I said, accepting his escort as the crowd began to disperse around us. "Because I'm only getting started." 2 years later, I stood in the gardens of my ancestral estate, the one that had been stripped from my father and awarded to me as compensation for his crimes, watching my husband play with our infant son. Lord Marcus Ravencrest had proven to be everything the Duke had promised: honorable, intelligent, and completely devoted to both my fortune and my ruthless approach to justice. Our marriage had been the social event of the decade, cementing my position as one of the most powerful women in the empire. My former family had received exactly what they deserved. Father had been stripped of his title and sentenced to 20 years of hard labor in the imperial mines. His health was failing rapidly under the harsh conditions, and the reports I received suggested he wouldn't survive another winter. Catherine had been exiled to a convent on the empire's most remote frontier, where she spent her days in poverty and penance, forbidden from any contact with the outside world. And Celestine was working as a tavern wench in the furthest province of the empire, her golden beauty faded from hard work and harder living. She'd tried to use her looks to secure a better position, but word of her family's crimes had followed her everywhere. No respectable man would touch her, and the disreputable ones found her damaged goods once they learned her history. "No regrets?" Marcus asked as he approached me, our son sleeping peacefully in his arms. "None whatsoever," I replied, taking the baby and settling him against my shoulder. "They made their choice when they decided I was worthless. I simply ensured they lived with the consequences." The Duke, now my closest advisor and dearest friend, appeared on the terrace with the day's correspondence. "The quarterly reports from the Corvelli holdings," he said, presenting me with a leather portfolio. "Profits are up 12% from last year." I smiled, thinking of how my mother would have been proud to see her daughter not just surviving, but thriving beyond her wildest dreams. "Excellent. And the other matter?" "Resolved as you requested. The new orphanage will bear your mother's name, and the staff has been instructed to pay special attention to any children who seem unwanted by their families." It was my latest project, ensuring that no child would suffer as I had suffered, that no family could systematically destroy a child's life without consequences. I'd used my wealth and influence to create a network of safe havens throughout the empire, places where discarded children could find protection and opportunity. "Perfect," I said, bouncing my son gently as he began to wake. "What else?" "A letter from the capital. It seems Celestine has been asking about employment opportunities in the city." "Has she now?" I considered this development with interest. "And what sort of employment is she seeking?" "Apparently, she's hoping to find work as a lady's maid or companion. She seems to believe that her breeding makes her suitable for such a position." I laughed, the sound clear and bright in the afternoon air. "How wonderfully optimistic of her. I trust you've made sure that every respectable household in the capital is aware of her family history?" "Naturally. Amazing how quickly word spreads about the daughters of convicted murderers." Marcus shook his head in amused disbelief. "Sometimes I think you're more ruthless than the emperor himself." "The emperor never had his family try to murder him for money," I pointed out reasonably. "I think my approach to justice is perfectly proportional." As the sun began to set over my beautiful gardens, I reflected on how far I'd come from that dying girl in the snow. I was no longer the servant who scrubbed floors and accepted abuse as the natural order of things. I was Lady Seraphina Corvelli Ashford Ravencrest, mistress of three great houses, mother to the future Duke of Ravencrest, and one of the most powerful women in the Empire. My family had tried to erase me from the world, to reduce me to nothing, so they could claim what was mine. Instead, they'd given me the greatest gift possible. They'd shown me exactly who they really were, and given me the motivation to become who I was always meant to be. My mother would have been proud,